Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. David Evans. I'm the ROM's James and Louise Temerty Endowed Chair of Vertebrate Paleontology, and I'm delighted that you could join us today for our Curator Conversations. This is a new digital program that explores themes and subjects from the ROM's collection alongside industry professionals. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ashinabek Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. Thank you for joining us today as I speak with Dr. Mark Crowther, Chair of the Department of Medicine and the Leo Pharma Chair in Thrombolism Research at McMaster University. Today we're going to talk about our recently co-authored research on the discovery of dinosaur cancer, as well as more broadly about diagnosing diseases in the fossil record. And this opens up a greater understanding of the evolution of disease and a greater appreciation of where we fit in the world. So I'd like to encourage you to submit your thoughts via the Q&A feature during this program, and we'll be live to answer your questions at the end. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks very much, David. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, so we have quite a history together. We met through actually the ROM governors at a donor event where you brought your family in for a behind the scenes tour. And like scientists often do, we started chatting about our various fields and seeing the connections between them. So do you want to sort of get the ball rolling here by telling our audience sort of how you came to be involved diagnosing this 75-year-old, million-year-old dinosaur patient?
Sure, thanks, David. So yeah, the story is actually an interesting one. My wife and I have been fortunate that we were able to become members of the Royal Ontario Museum quite a number of years ago, and we had decided to increase our involvement with the Royal Ontario Museum, and we donated enough money that we could be part of what's something called the Royal Patron Circle, which is a level of contributions which reflect our great interest in the success of the Royal Ontario Museum. And as one of the benefits of that, we were able to access what's called a curatorial tour. So David would never have known what this would have led to, but my parents were having their 50th wedding anniversary, and they asked if we could have a tour at the ROM, and I had that arranged. And then I asked them what they wanted to have a tour of, and to my surprise, they said the dinosaur exhibits. And so that's how I met David on a Saturday afternoon in the winter at the Royal Ontario Museum. Now probably 6 years ago, I guess, something.
Yeah, like about that, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, we had a great tour, but it turned out that David had an interest in trying to explore further some of the super interesting observations they'd made in dinosaur bones. And it turns out that because of the work that I do, I'm a hematologist, but at that point I was also running the Department of Pathology, which is the doctors who look after patients who help to diagnose patients with various diseases, including bone diseases. I was able to help David put together a team of people who have a lot of expertise that then allowed us to make this diagnosis of a kind of rare cancer called Osteosarcoma, which is the kind of cancer that Terry Fox had an amputation as a result of and ultimately died from. So it's quite well known in Canada. We made a diagnosis of that in a 75 million-year-old dinosaur.
Yeah, it's a really unique collaboration now. As a paleontologist, I look at bones literally all day, every day. And it's not unusual to see bones that are damaged and diseased and rehealed or show the signs of injury. And in fact, most dinosaur skeletons that we dig up have some form of injury, usually broken bones. But there are some rare diseases, and we started talking about this, and as we sort of started to riff on dinosaur pathologies, you brought in some of your staff at the time. We became collaborators on the project, and I was showing you some of the oddities from our collection, and we started talking about, you know, what would be the coolest, the most interesting ailment to find in a dinosaur, and we came up with bone cancer. You know, it sounds, you know, diseases mostly affect soft tissues, finding rare diseases in dinosaurs can be tricky, but because bone cancer, osteosarcoma, is a cancer of the bone forming cells, it leaves a distinctive signature on the bone. And so we thought that we could identify this if we got the right individual. But it was really like searching for a needle in a haystack because, you know, cancer is a rare disease. getting a cancer that could manifest on bone is rare. Getting that individual who has that bone cancer that gets to an advanced state enough to manifest on the bone and then get fossilized is rare still. And then to find that bone in the fossil record is even rarer still. But I knew there was a real excellent collection of paleopathology or pathological bones at the Royal Trail Museum. And so Mark and Snezana Popovich and I, we took a trip to the Royal Trail Museum to see if we could uncover evidence of dinosaur cancer or any other rare diseases. And that was a particularly fun day. You know, what was it like for you when we went through sort of drawers and drawers, like of hundreds and hundreds of pathological disease dinosaur bones?
Yeah, it's unbelievably exciting. I'll say that, you know, I've had an interest in dinosaurs for my entire life, probably going back, well, I'm certain going back to when I was a kid and went to the ROM on school trips and went to the old part of the ROM and saw the dinosaur displays and thought that was fascinating. And then as I, you know, run along in my life, I never thought I would do anything to further my interest in this. And this opportunity to meet David came up, and it's led to all kinds of fun stuff. The cool thing about going to the Tyrrell Museum, for those of you who haven't been there, and I imagine most of you haven't, the Tyrrell Museum is probably the best dinosaur museum in the world. David?
I mean, other than the ROM?
Other than the ROM, of course, but I mean, other than the ROM.
No, it's probably the biggest museum dedicated to paleontology in the world, and it sits right in the Badlands of Alberta, which is probably the best place to find a dinosaur in the world. So its collections are really second to none.
So when you go into the Tyrrell Museum through the front doors, it's a typical museum. There's all kinds of great displays. There's many very famous dinosaurs on display, a very famous Tyrannosaurus Rex, lots of other stuff. But what we did is, because of the contacts that David had and the experience he's had and the fact he used to work there and his very strong links with the investigators who worked there, we were able to go through the back door. And that was a lot more exciting because, you know, the back door of the Tyrrell leads into essentially a warehouse that's filled with these enormous drawers that contain thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dinosaur bones. And we were able to spend a whole day looking through the bone collection to help us to identify some bones that look sufficiently abnormal that we could do more research on them. And in fact, I said, really, to be quite honest, my role was actually quite simple because I was just basically walking around in awe of these dinosaur bones. Fortunately, our colleagues at the Tyrrell had a pretty good indexing system, and we were able to go to a list of abnormal bones. And Dr. Darren Tankey, who is key to our research, had found that bone way back in 1981. It was all very well categorized. I actually had my daughter with me. She's been an integral part of this investigation, and she actually was the one who went out to the drawers and found these bones and brought this one particular bone back, which caused Dr. Popovich, who was mentioned earlier, to become very excited. And David's holding the bone up right there. That's what the bone actually looks like. And Dr. Popovich became really excited because to her, that looked exactly like what we would expect in a human when we suspected that this was a case of bone cancer.
Yeah, I mean, this bone jumped out at me as well. It was, as Mark said, dug up in 1981 by crews of the Trail Museum in a mass grave site of the horned dinosaur Centrosaurus, so an older cousin of the famous Triceratops. And the bone bed that this bone is from is actually a very significant and famous one. It's one that the ROM collected way back in 1918, and it presented some of the first evidence that dinosaurs were herding animals. And these studies came out in the early 80s. And that the bone bed was being worked pretty intensely then. As I mentioned before, dinosaurs having broken bones that have rehealed isn't uncommon. And when the excavators dug up this particular bone, they noticed that it had this big sort of blobby end to it, where otherwise it would have been smoothed and well-formed. And they thought that this was a bone that had been broken during an animal's life and rehealed. But when Rianne brought the bone to us, I noticed that it was unusual in that it wasn't just malformed around the putative break, that there was additional bone deposited down the shaft of what is a shin bone or a fibula. And it looked really odd to me for something that was suggested to be a break, which the healing is usually localized. And Snezana recognized that immediately as the possible progression of a bone cancer tumor from the knee end of this bone towards the shin. And of course, the cancer had been manifest much longer towards the knee. So you have this massive, gnarly, bony tumor. And then that's actually worked its way through the cortex of the bone and deformed it further down towards the shin. And so we had a candidate of bone cancer. It's pretty remarkable. And that's where our sort of big time collaboration with multiple different diagnostic experts began. The research really began when we found the candidate, and it was another 3 years until we were able to show the diagnosis. And because of, it was Mark's connections and his team at McMaster that allowed us to do that. Do you want to discuss just the importance of having such a large scale team of experts, kind of like you would have if you were undergoing cancer treatment today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's completely true to say that to diagnose cancer in a human, in a patient now, I'll be in clinic tomorrow. It's possible that I'll see somebody with a new cancer tomorrow. It's not just looking at the person. It's not just looking at X-rays. It's what we call multimodal. It means that you have to look at the patient, you have to look at the abnormality, you have to look at the X-rays, and you have to look at the tissue sections. And essentially, when we set out to do this project, that's what we were able to assemble. So David obviously is a world-leading expert in paleontology, and I'm not. I'm nothing to do with paleontology, but I did have access to a pathologist, a doctor whose expertise was in looking at bones. Then we also were able to access some experts in engineering who were experts in imaging and how to take X-rays of rocks, essentially, because that bone is essentially a rock. We were able to access some other experts in pathology. It was really a team effort. David's then graduate student, who's an expert in how we actually take the samples, was involved in the project too. So bringing this group together allowed us to make this diagnosis with the same certainty that we would have in a human, which is very different than people who've said they found cancer in dinosaurs before, because they didn't have access to these kind of resources. And what we did in this case is essentially identical to what we would do in a human. Take advantage of multiple people who have a very strong background in various technical specialties in order to come together to make a solid diagnosis.
Yeah, so even though there's been a handful of other suggestions of cancer in a dinosaur, what makes our paper special and why it got so much attention is this is really the first time that we went from sort of gross morphology all the way down to the cellular level to basically diagnose the dinosaur at a level that we would be confident in the same diagnosis in a human, right, Mark?
Absolutely. We would, if this was if this dinosaur limped into the clinic today, we would be sufficiently confident in the diagnosis to treat it if we had access to treatments that would be effective for dinosaurs. I doubt we would, but we would be, our confidence in this diagnosis is exactly the same as the confidence that we would have if we had a patient in the clinic tomorrow who had an osteosarcoma. I wouldn't see that patient. I don't see patients with osteosarcoma, but they certainly would appear, they could certainly be in clinics in Hamilton or in Toronto tomorrow, and there will be patients with osteosarcoma in clinics in Hamilton or Toronto tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's exciting to be part of a group. Like most paleopathological studies involve paleontologists leading the study, for instance, who don't have a strong medical background, or there's often a radiologist or one medical expert, and they only go to a certain level. What was neat about the collaboration is that at the ROM, I've built one of the world's leading paleohistology labs. So this is where you can cut bones open, grind them down so you can pass light through them and look at them under a microscope. And they're preserved at molecular levels, so you can actually basically see the bone tissues. And what we were able to do with this particular specimen, thanks to the Royal Trail Museum, is actually basically go right down to the tissue level. Think of it sort of as a biopsy for this dinosaur. And that really allowed us to clinch the diagnosis. And so that made waves around the world. It was published in the journal, The Lancet Oncology, so the cancer journal affiliated with The Lancet, which is one of, if not the biggest medical journals in the world. And this is something I never thought I would ever be a part of in my life. In fact, a lot of my colleagues joke that this might be the highest impact dinosaur paper ever published. And they were referring to journal impact factor. And that's because there's just so much work that's being done on cancer. To be able to contribute something that community found interesting is something really special. But it's more than just that. This tells us something about the history of cancer. So do you want to maybe share why this is significant from a medical point of view, Mark?
Yeah, for sure. So, this is really an interesting observation. So, there's a couple things that are important. The first is, when you hear a lot about cancer, you hear about cancer in patients who smoke, or cancer in patients who have work exposures, and it leads us sometimes to think that all cancers are due to something else. But in fact, clearly, hopefully this dinosaur wasn't smoking. Gary Larson might have something else to say about that, but in general, we don't think dinosaurs were smoking. And this dinosaur presumably was eating a normal dinosaur diet. This is just proves to us yet again that cancers are part of the condition of being an animal on the earth, that occasionally the regulations that control cell division, how cells grow and divide, go out of whack, and they can go out of whack in anything. And so they go out of whack in a dinosaur in exactly the same way they can in a human. It's interesting to think about this, that osteosarcoma is a disease of children and older children and very young adults, not so much of older adults, because we believe it's related to the rapid growth and division of bony tissues, and that's the area within which these tumors grow. And obviously, dinosaurs grew at an enormous rate, a truly enormous rate, and many times higher than humans. And so it would make perfect sense that if we were going to find a bone tumor in a dinosaur, we would find it it would be an osteosarcoma, because of the speed with which their bones grow and divide. Another question that people ask sometimes is, what does this tell us anything about human osteosarcoma? Well, of course, not directly, but indirectly, it tells us something very important. That is that if we're looking for common denominators between, around what causes osteosarcoma, we should be looking in the genes and in the tissues where there's commonality between birds and dinosaurs and humans. Because if we presume that the biology of this is the same, then the underlying predispositions have to be the same, and that means that the common elements in our genes between dinosaurs and humans, which would be many, are the areas we should be looking to see if we can identify what causes osteosarcoma in humans. So not only is it neat, like it's a really neat thing to be involved with, but it also does help us to understand the science of cancers a little bit as well.
What I found really fascinating is, how the disease is manifest is strikingly similar in the dinosaur and the human. So the most common place that humans get our osteosarcoma is in the long bones, and in fact in the long bones of the leg around the knee. So in the fibula, in the tibia in particular, and that is exactly what we see in this dinosaur. And in fact, one of our main points of comparison to the dinosaur bone we had in the paper was an osteosarcoma in a human fibula, in exactly the same bone, in exactly the same place. So it really shows the antiquity of this disease and how it doesn't just affect humans, it affects all of tetrapods in a very similar way. So I found that, I think, particularly fascinating. In fact, I gave an interview to an American news outlet, and the interviewer, she knew a lot about this, and I mentioned that, and she said, yeah, one of my family members had an osteosarcoma in exactly the same spot. And then it really hit home just how this research could touch people's lives, and how, especially say a kid with cancer might look at a dinosaur and maybe feel a little bit less alone. And so it was a really cool project to be involved with. It also tells us something about the lives of dinosaurs. So this particular bone I mentioned was found in a bone bed. This is a very advanced stage of this cancer. In fact, it probably had spread to other body systems, given just how much it's invaded the bone. In fact, this bone should be about twice as long as it actually is. But it was found within a herd of dinosaurs. It's very unlikely that this dinosaur was killed by the cancer. In fact, the explanation of this assemblage is that this was a herd struck down in a coastal flooding event. And this particular animal showing, this advanced stage of cancer would have certainly been weakened by it. Its movement would have been affected by it. And it's very likely that the fact that these animals lived in these large herds allowed this particular individual enough protection to escape the tyrannosaur top predators of the time, and for that cancer to reach such an advanced stage that allowed us to really easily recognize it when we were searching through the collection. So, it's further evidence that that dinosaurs, even though they seem like such powerful and are almost sort of mythical creatures, They were real living animals that suffered from the same types of ailments and diseases, even rare ones like bone cancer that humans and other animals do today.
Yeah, and I would, just to highlight that, if someone's asking the questions, and we'll get to the questions at the end. And please, again, if you have questions, please type them into the question and answer box, and we'll do our best to get through them all. But would this animal have been in pain? Almost for sure, this animal would have been in pain. This was a pathological, this is a very bad pathology, and also very likely, although we can never be able to tell because we don't have any other pieces from this specific animal, that it would have spread to other organs given the stage at which it is in this bone. This is advanced stage disease and probably would have spread elsewhere. And I think that a cool thing for me, David, I think David knows this, but we ROM used to have these sessions where you would go and listen to lectures, and I went to a couple that David did, and David once brought in Dr. Phil Curie, who's a very famous, probably other than David, probably the most famous Canadian paleontologist.
He is.
And I was in the audience. David wouldn't have known who I was, but I was kind of in awe of these two guys talking up there. And it's been really fun to become a friend with David. And then also I've met Dr. Curie twice now at David's field camp, which we've also been able to go to. And so this not only just the scientific interest of this, but also the relationship that I've dealt with David and the ability for me as just a common member of the population to be able to interact with the ROM and get a real sensation for the value that the Royal Ontario Museum brings to the province of Ontario and around the world.
Well, I would say your scientific expertise, I would say you're not a regular human. However, it has been fun. We've collaborated more on other projects. And one of the things that you've been able to help me do through your involvement with the ROM governors and donating to my field program is to actually bring your family and come out and do a dinosaur dig. In fact, this bone was dug up like every dinosaur that we see. It started out in the rock and it was found by a scientist going out in the field to dig up dinosaurs. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so again, it was great, really exciting. I know I have a pretty interesting job in the real life. I run a big department. I have lots of people who work for me. I look after a lot of sick patients, and the people who work for me look after even more sick patients. So it's nice to have a completely different outlet, and this has been a completely different outlet. Because we did become members of the ROM, which all of you listening could become members of the ROM, and became more and more interested. We donated at a higher level, and when you donate at a certain level, you can become part of this Royal Patron Circle, which is really neat. It gives you some special access to the museum. It's not super expensive. As a result of that, we met David, and after the conversations we talked about, we asked David if we could join him on his field team, and I'll just share a couple of pictures here that I have called up today. So when you get the invitation to go with Dr. David Evans out dinosaur hunting, you've got to take it. So I hope you can see, David, my screen there. This is you can't see, this is my wife, this is my daughter. This is a dinosaur that my family and we've been out 3 of the last 5 years, and the pit certainly looks different. This is a long time ago, but that's a Procerolophus, which is a duck-billed dinosaur, and that's the actual excavation site. And so, we're actually knees down in the side of a hill, digging out dinosaur bones. You can see the plaster cast here over a bone that's sticking out of the side of the hill. Here's another one here that we had just uncovered that day. You can sort of start to see it there, but that's one of the bones of the pelvis. And you can see this is real paleontology, right? We have the little brushes, we have toothbrushes. We're busy removing the dirt, the overburden off these things and finding bones as they actually come out of the earth. And the first time that these bones have been seen in 65 million years or so. So pretty exciting.
So Mark, going from sort of a paleo fan to actually doing the real thing, you've seen the digs on TV and in the movies. What surprised you the most about coming to Southern Alberta with me?
The thing that surprised me the absolute most, to be quite honest, was that the fact that dinosaur bones are actually really common. And so, if you're in the right location and the dinosaurs have been preserved in the right way, when you go out into the field, there are dinosaur bones everywhere. And we did an earlier session today. I don't have the picture with me right now, but I have a picture of myself pointing to a giant leg bone from a frilled dinosaur like the Centrosaurus sticking out of the side of the hill. And I said to David, he first showed me that, I said, "Is that of any interest to you whatsoever?" And he sort of said, "No." No. And the reason not is that there's been lots of legs of these frilled dinosaurs dug up, and nobody's really interested in them. And my daughter, who's always had an interest in science has really benefited from this. And in fact, it's quite funny now when she goes out with David. she's walking through and she'll look down at the ground and say, oh, another piece of dinosaur bone. And it's like in the past you would have been, oh my goodness, that's so cool. But now it's kind of, oh my goodness. So even my wife, my daughter, and I and our son have developed a little bit of expertise. And you start to realize that some dinosaur bones are interesting and some aren't. I will say that the experience of being on the field team has also been great. David's field camp is 100 kilometers away from Medicine Hat, Alberta. It's 100 kilometers from the closest gas station. You are literally in the middle of nowhere when you're there. I don't know, David, if you can see that image,
Yep.
but this is a picture of David's field camp, and that's my daughter again, and that's our accommodation that we live in when we're out there, our 2 tents. And you can see it's just beautiful countryside, and we stay at a base camp. Food is really great. It's a lot of fun to be out there. And I think the one thing that David has been very kind to provide us with the education we need, that we're very comfortable now digging up dinosaurs, and I think we kind of have a standing invitation to go out there to help dig dinosaurs.
Yeah, you do. You've been out so many times. You guys are trained up. You know exactly what you're doing. I don't have to worry about you. You're like ideal. Like you're your own crew. You come with a giant pickup truck, which is always helpful. And Mark, you yourself, I mean, you can move rock. That really impressed me actually. And Rianne is phenomenal out there. She's got an amazing eye for finding cool fossils. It's been fun to see her develop. She started coming out in junior high, and now she's going into her second or third year of university. And it was neat to sort of see her get an interest in this. And she was mentored by some of my graduate students who took her under their wing. She might not go on to be a paleontologist necessarily, but I think she's interested in vet school and other sciences. And it just goes to show, paleontology, studying dinosaurs, there's a lot we can learn from it, as we just said. But there's one of the fundamental values of it is that people are interested in it. It's a gateway to the other sciences. Kids start asking questions about dinosaurs in a scientific way. Why did T-Rex have small arms, for instance? And they get interested in that scientific process, and most don't get to live a life like mine and become a paleontologist, but they go on to develop interest in other sciences, whether it's microbiology or engineering, or geology, or veterinary medicine. So it's been great to see Rianne develop that scientific bug. And in fact, she was one of the authors on the paper that we published, Dinosaur Cancer.
Totally agree. I think, David, we're supposed to go on to the questions. I just wanted to share one more picture here. So, the neat thing for us has been, because we have access to David and to the back doors of museums, and this is my daughter, Rianne, holding a tooth. This is a real tooth from a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And one of the things I learned that's really interesting, this was dug up just outside of a place called East End, Saskatchewan. There's a museum there, and I'd encourage you, when you're allowed to go back to Saskatchewan, you should all go and have a look at this great little museum. And you won't get to hold the tooth like Rianne is holding it, but this thing is actually, it's a tooth from a Tyrannosaurus Rex. You can see how big it is, and it's impressive that you can, through the Royal Ontario Museum, and by becoming a donor and a supporter of the organization, if you find the right people in the right circumstance, you can really take advantage of that and learn all kinds of really neat stuff. So, David, we got a bunch of questions here. Maybe what I can do is I'll just run through a couple of them. The question from Mexico City. Could you tell us what other dinosaur diseases have been discovered, and is this the first time that this type of cancer has been found in a dinosaur?
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time that we've been able to. It's the first time we've been able to basically diagnose a cancer at the level that we would expect of a human patient. Osteosarcoma had been, I believe, it had been postulated in one other dinosaur, right, from the Jurassic of the American West, but they didn't go through this sort of multimodal analysis that we did with a team of experts. And the fact that we were able to diagnose to such a level of certainty is what really made the paper special. I mean, would you like to add anything to that, Mark?
No, I just say there have been people who suspected cancer before, but they've been based simply on, this is a radiologist asking this question, so I can say based on simple fluoroscopy, and certainly not the kind of really meticulous analysis that we did. So we're very confident that this is not only that this is osteosarcoma, but that this is the first case of osteosarcoma. The next question is, can we tell whether this might have spread or metastasized? I think we addressed that already. This is very advanced cancer, and it probably had metastasized. When did cancer in a dinosaur begin? Was this a juvenile? These were all questions that were asked. So probably, David, was this a juvenile? Probably not, right? Or probably a young adult.
It's not a juvenile. It's not a juvenile, but it's a subadult. So it's just finishing its exponential growth stage, as far as we can tell. So it would have probably when the cancer initially developed, the animal was growing quite rapidly. That's how I would put it. But it wasn't a young individual. It was a subadult going on adulthood. But it still fits what we would expect, where we would expect to see an osteosarcoma. Another question here is do birds get cancer? Yeah, they do get osteosarcomas, and this looks an awful lot like what we see in birds as well. We didn't have an example of birds to compare to directly. We just had a human, but they are very similar from what I can tell.
A question is, do you find any bones with metastatic cancer? That's actually a really interesting question, because osteosarcoma is unique. You can make the diagnosis from the bone. The problem we would have is if say a dinosaur had lung cancer, for example, or skin cancer, and it metastasized to the bone, it would probably just leave a hole. And so we wouldn't really be able to tell anything about it. There are some very specific types of cancer that we might be able to diagnose. So one is called multiple myeloma, which is a specific cancer of the blood cells, and it leaves a very specific type of injury on the bones. And so, that's another project for the future. David's got a skull from a pachycephalosaur, which may actually suggest that the animal had multiple myeloma, and we'll need to spend a bit of time thinking about whether that's actually possible or not. Question about whether this was hereditary or from an outside source. Well, no, that's a great question. I don't know that osteosarcoma is felt to be a hereditary disease. It's what I call a bad luck disease, which means that unfortunately people are just destined to get it. Who knows why? And I suspect that's the case here in the dinosaur. Some unfortunate circumstance led to this diagnosis occurring in this animal. David, you better answer the next one, because I won't be able to pronounce it correctly.
What's the next one here?
Are theropod fossils more likely to show evidence of pathologies and injuries than those of ornithischians and sauropods?
Ornithischians. Yeah, that's a good question. In my experience, I don't see a difference. Both theropods and ornithischians tend to be heavily affected by diseased bones, and particularly broken bones. So if you're at the ROM, take a look at some of the skeletons that we have on display. Most of them are ornithischians, and most of the complete skeletons actually show multiple pathologies. So you could take a look at the Griposaurus that has broken ribs, or the Chasmosaurus that has weird osteoporosis of the hands, plus some deformed ribs. The Parasaurolophus is our ambassador, our famous tube-crested dinosaur, has pathologies all over it. Just part of a team that's describing all these weird pathologies on Parasaurolophus, which is really exciting, led by a graduate student, Filippo Bertazzo. Both ornithischians, meat eaters and plant eaters, are highly susceptible to injury and disease, I would say.
So David, we have to be on our best behavior, because in the chat function, I see now some of the clinicians from the oncology service at the Ontario Vet College have tuned in. So we're very, very common neoplasia in dogs. So osteosarcoma is common in dogs. I didn't know that, but interesting to hear, and we have to be on our best behavior. One of the questions is, would this animal have been limping on a shorter leg? Interesting question. No, the leg wouldn't have been shorter, because there's two weight-bearing bones in that part of the leg, one called the tibia and one called the fibula. And this pathology is in the fibula, so presumably the leg wouldn't have been shortened, but the animal would almost for certain have been limping, both as a result of pain, but also because the joint just wouldn't work as well as it, or the leg wouldn't work as well as it should. David mentioned that one thing is, other pathologies, and we do have a couple of other projects. And so at the last Society for Vertebrate Paleontology meeting, which was just a couple of weeks ago, we did have a case of tennis elbow in a dinosaur. Now, we don't suspect that the dinosaur was actually playing tennis, but it's the same kind of injury. And so we've reported that. And Dr. Sepper Ektieri, who was the lead author on the Lancet Oncology paper, is really interested to see whether or not dinosaurs got osteoarthritis. He's a surgeon who specializes in the treatment of osteoarthritis of the hips and knees, and he'd love to do a project where he looks at the hips and knees from dinosaurs and see whether or not they developed osteoarthritis just like humans do, and they probably do. They have the same mechanical issues, and they're bearing a lot more weight, so I suspect they also got osteoarthritis.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of great questions here. You know, when we went to the collections at the Trail Museum, we looked through, there was hundreds of pathological bones. Most of them were broken and rehealed bones. But there's a question here from Shady. Do you think that there are more fossils with cancer stored in the collections that have been prepared and that haven't been identified yet? And there's a couple of questions along this line. Of the bones that we saw, of the 1,000 bones that we saw and the thousands that have been collected from that individual bone bed, that's another question that came up. This is the only one that really showed signs of cancer. So talking about the rarity of this is probably super rare. It was probably rare in the populations, and you know, it's really like finding a needle in a haystack. You know, as I said before, it's like the individual has to have this particular type of cancer that manifests on the bones. It has to get to an advanced stage that you can detect it by looking at the bones. That individual has to be fossilized, and then we have to find that fossil, and we have to find the particular bones the bones of that individual that show it. It's incredibly rare. From a population point of view, I'm not 100% sure how rare it would have been in the population, but overall, but what we can say is that you know, we do not have many examples of this out there. Although I do suspect that if we start looking deeper in the collections, we will find more cases of this. And as Mark said, dinosaurs grow very rapidly. You know, it's possible that the cells made mistakes, and there should be more examples out there, I would predict.
Just to build on that, one of the questions is at a cellular level, how does this osteosarcoma compare to human osteosarcoma? Well, so really important, as David said, the pathology, the histology of the bones in dinosaurs, if they're preserved properly, is exquisitely preserved. The cells aren't preserved, so you can't actually comment directly on the histology, but I can say microscopically, this looks identical to a human tumor. If you put the two of them side by side and adjusted the colors, and you presented them to somebody who's kind of a knowledgeable but not expert like me, I would never be able to tell the difference. And grossly, other than that fibula that David's holding up being massively larger than a human fibula, it looks exactly like a very advanced osteosarcoma would look like in a human. Here's a good question, David. Is the ROM planning a special exhibition on pathology in dinosaurs? And so you were on a call today talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, the ROM isn't planning a special exhibit per se right now, but the other museums have shown interest in this bone. It's too early for me to say you know, what's happening at this other major museum, but there is some interest in getting in incorporating this into a planned exhibit on cancer, you know, very soon. So yeah, that would be the answer to that. We don't have a specific exhibition planned. Although it's an interesting idea, because I think it does tell us something about the lives of these dinosaurs. I think it is interesting to a lot of people. I mean, including myself. As I said, we tend to think of these dinosaurs as such powerful animals, but you know, our study really shows that that they were susceptible to all the same, you know, diseases and injuries, and even these rare diseases that humans and other animals are today. So it gives them a certain life, even in the death of this particular individual, to know that dinosaurs were affected by these diseases.
Yeah, I think so. Even if the ROM isn't planning a special exhibit, you know, you can go to the ROM right now. It is open despite COVID. You have to book ahead, and there's very limited people. So it's an extremely good time to go to the ROM because it's not crowded with people. And you know, if you know what you're looking for, there is already a pathology display there, because when you walk around the dinosaur hall, many of the dinosaurs on display have pathologies, and once you know where they are, they're really interesting to look at. So yep, probably the easiest one to see if you're not trained. There's probably two that are really easy to see. So the first is when you first walk into the dinosaur display, on the right-hand side, there's a large theropod, an Albertosaurus. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yep. The Gorgosaurus, formerly known as Albertosaurus. Yeah.
And so it has the same kind of injury as this animal has. It has a fractured fibula that has healed. And when you look at it, you can actually, once you have a bit of an eye, you can actually see where the injury was, and that the dinosaur lived long enough for it to be well healed and may have lived for years afterwards. I'm going to share one other picture. This is the last picture I have, but I think it's relevant to this question. Another injury that you can see in all kinds of dinosaurs, and David may find this one a bit humorous. David, can you see my screen there?
Yep.
Yeah, so this is the head of one of the frilled dinosaurs, and this is Dr. John Fernandez, who unfortunately, since this picture was taken, has actually died himself. But this is John spending some time looking at the frill of these dinosaurs. And the frills of these dinosaurs, when you go to a dinosaur museum, they love to mount these dinosaurs. And these dinosaurs, their frills have big holes in them. So you can see a big hole here and here. That's just probably there to reduce weight. But they have all kinds of other random holes in them. And that's a pathology in a dinosaur. And probably that's due to a penetrating injury, maybe from a mating display or something else, where these dinosaurs are running into each other and they actually drove their horns right through each other's frill. And so when you go into the display at the Royal Ontario Museum and you look at the frills from the many ceratopsians that are on display, you'll see pathologies right there sitting in front of you. So to answer the question, there's a ton of pathology on display. If you become a member, if you can get into one of these curatorial guide tours from David, maybe you get your own customized tour of the pathologies of the ROM.
I think I've got time for one more question. And I think looking to the future makes a lot of sense. So what are the next steps for your future research? Are there other, have you noticed other diseases in your study of these pathological bones along the way? Mark alluded to that already, but when we were looking at that osteopathology collection at the Trail Museum, we did notice some other interesting bones that we're working on right now. One of them is Mark noticed a bone that seemed to have all the hallmarks of a repetitive strain injury that we know as tennis elbow. So we recently presented on that at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting. And then we also took on loan a couple of other bones that seem to show some rare diseases. So there's lots of research to come. And I think what this project really shows is the importance of using it really shows the importance of collaborating with medical professionals and larger teams of medical professionals, as would happen if you were a cancer patient or had a rare disease today, but applying the expertise in the medical community and the paleontological community combined to better understand these ancient diseases and how diseases evolved. The tack that we take, where we had 6 or 8 medical professionals and several paleontologists, really allowed us to tie this case of cancer in a dinosaur up with a bow, where our research groups on their own wouldn't have been able to do that. So it was really exciting for me to work in that sort of high-paced environment. I think that the medical team was maybe a little bit surprised at how slow we work paleontologically, but our patients have been dead 75 million years, so we don't have to worry about it too much.
Yeah, David, that was hilarious for me, because I work in a world where you don't get the paper out in a few months, you're in trouble because someone else is going to publish it. And David pointed out to me 2 things. One is it's been in the ground for 65 million years. Another year isn't going to hurt. And secondarily, there is only one. So it's not like anybody else can scoop you because it's the only one. Maybe, David, one last question here, which is actually an interesting scientific one, and then we'll finish. In the veterinary world, we see osteosarcoma in large breed dogs, probably over 10-fold more common than in humans. Yet we very rarely see it in birds, reptiles, or large, fast-growing animals like horses or whales. Is this dinosaur a one-off, like we might see 1 in a million in horses, or is it going to be more common? And obviously that's coming, I hope, from one of our friends at the Ontario Veterinary College, and thank you for that question. I don't know. I don't think we know the answer to that. There's a vast number of dinosaur bones dug up every single year around the world. We're not aware of any others of these. So it's not going to be superbly common. I think that the growth profile of dinosaurs, like horses, only probably 10-fold faster. So if there is a relationship between velocity of bone growth and likelihood of getting osteosarcoma, we would see it in dinosaurs because they do grow at an immense rate. I don't know if we have any younger people, but David, it might be worth your just pointing out to people how fast dinosaurs grew, as they're going towards adulthood.
Yeah, I mean, they grew extremely rapidly. These long neck dinosaurs, the biggest ones, I can just throw out a figure. Based on some calculations, they were putting on up to 10 kilograms a day, based on some estimates. I mean, that's just like crazy rates of growth. an animal like Centrosaurus, it would reach its full body size, which is bigger than a rhino, getting close to an Indian elephant, in about 5 to 7 years. So they were incredibly rapidly growing animals, and their bones were very large and grew very rapidly. So they certainly would. It's where you'd expect to see an osteosarcoma. So I think I have to end it there. I want to thank Dr. Crowther for joining us here today for this important conversation, and the fact that it really demonstrates the value of cross-disciplinary research and the importance of museum collections to making these types of breakthroughs. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today, and we hope to see you again on the next curator conversation, which is November 18th. Details are all upcoming on the ROM homepage. ROM at Home is where you can find that. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and it's been great chatting with you, Mark.
Thanks, David. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.